I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm grateful to you because I know that you're under pressure, some of you for projects and all of you for exams, so it's appreciated to give them an hour. What I intend to do is to speak briefly and then open it up so you can raise questions, some of which have been sent in to Reece in advance, and that's absolutely fine, but I don't mind anything within reason being raised during the course of the next hour, so please feel free to do that. This is Cosby, who's heard it all before, and he decided he'd like to indicate, get down. Very big lump. My life has been both giving me enormous joy and bedeviled by dogs. I've had 6 guide dogs, I'll tell you about them as we go through. But dogs have a complete life of their own, and most of my dogs have been extremely well trained, but one of them certainly wasn't. She was called Ruby, my first dog. And I used to have to keep coins in my pocket because when we stepped off buses or trains, there'd usually be a cry of pain as a small child had an ice cream or a lolly taken out of their hands. So I got used to having to be very diplomatic about this. But the great thing about a dog is it breaks the ice. Now, I chair the University of Law. I don't have a law degree. I have a degree in political theory and institutions. I did do A-level law, and when I was teaching, post-16 teaching, and I have a teaching certificate, they found out that I got A-level law. They said, "Oh, you could teach law." I said, "No, I can't teach law. I'm not swatting it up at the weekend and trying to present myself as being capable of informing young people about the law." When I became Home Secretary, I pretty well took a PhD in about 3 months because the necessity to learn about the law very rapidly and to get to grips with what was happening around the attack on the World Trade Center on the 11th of September 2001 meant that I really had to get up to speed very quickly, and I became a barrack. I haven't heard the expression for a long time, but do you know the expression of barrack room lawyer? It means somebody who thinks they're a lawyer without having any grasp of the law. And I had to do that very quickly indeed because we were dealing with the most enormous issues on counter-terrorism, on civil liberties, on how to balance the two and have proportionality. Anyway, I promised to say a little bit about my background as well. I was born without sight, and I learned to manipulate. You see, politicians are supposed to be full of sweetness and light, but I thought I'd tell you that I did learn to manipulate the world at a very early stage, because I was in and out of hospital and they were trying to find out what was wrong with my sight, and they thought I might have got a tumour on the brain and all sorts. And by the time I was 3, I'd been in hospital loads of times, and I learned that it was a different kind of signal than you get with ambulances now. It wasn't a siren, it was a bell. And the bell for ice cream vans and the bell for the ambulances were pretty much the same. And I used to start yelling, ice cream, apparently. My mother said, what I managed to do is to persuade them to put ice cream in the fridge for me. And every time I heard an ambulance, I demanded ice cream. And it's been down it ever since. I went to school for the blind. It was horrendous because if you go away from home at the age of 4 to a boarding school, it doesn't do you a great deal of good. But it did toughen me up. You had to learn to make your own bed, clean your shoes, do things for yourself. You had to learn to survive, including roller skating. I managed to end up in hospital with my head stitched, which probably accounts for 1 or 2 things, for hitting steps as I was roller skating. We used to play cricket with a bell in the ball, and it was more like willow on little boys' heads than it was willow on leather. You can imagine what it was like, fielding in the slips and somebody can't see it. Oops, sorry about that. It was a tough environment, and it certainly stood me in good stead in one sense for life, but emotionally quite bad in another. And you'll find throughout the work you're doing in the future as lawyers that you're dealing not just with practicalities and rationalities, you're dealing with deep-seated emotions as well, so it's just worth bearing that in mind. The school I then went to didn't do any examinations. The guy who headed it had a PhD, but he didn't believe that blind children could or should take public examinations. In those days it was O-level and A-levels rather than GCSEs. So I started to go to evening class when I was 16, and I did a couple of O-levels each year, taking one night on each for a year. God knows how I passed. If I hadn't passed the first two, I probably wouldn't have carried on, because obviously you need that boost and you need that confidence to be able to carry on. And I suddenly realised it was possible. I was going to be able to do this, and after 3 years I accumulated 7 O-levels, and I started to do A-levels. During the day I was doing a commercial course, which effectively was learning how to, what is now word process, learning how to type, and to use a Braille shorthand machine to be able to write shorthand. And I got a job, literally just as a clerk typist, back with the gas industry, the gas board in Sheffield. It was one of those terrible things where the people advising me on careers had this wonderful notion that as my dad had been killed in a works accident at the gas works, they owed me one and they should give me a job. It's a bit macabre, really, when you think about it. We also could have done with good lawyers at the time my dad was killed as well, because he was of retirement age, been asked to stay on to train people. The battle for compensation was absolutely horrendous. And those of you who are interested in employment or safety law, you will be doing a fantastic service to people who are often absolutely bewildered and up against it. And when I became Work and Pension Secretary, I was responsible for the Health and Safety Commission and the executive, and started the process of trying to get a meaningful occupational health programme off the ground, as well as reinforcing the importance of health and safety. So things affect you in life, and sometimes you get the chance to do something about it. My granddad, this is not all misery, by the way, I do intend to cheer you up, but my granddad died in the most horrendous circumstances in what was basically a workhouse, if you know the term. It was a totally decrepit hospital for frail elderly people that was literally out of the 19th century, and he fell down some steps and died. And I swore that if I ever had the chance, I would do something to put that right, to make sure that people in ageing had the dignity of care at home or proper residential homes. And I then later on was able to do that, because when I was on Sheffield City Council, before I became the leader of the council, I was the chair of social services, as it was called in those days. It's called adult services now, for 4 years. And we started building really decent residential homes, including for those with dementia, and we massively expanded the home help and the home warden service. And that was really something that had driven me from the experience as a child, as a teenager, in terms of wanting to change the world for the better. And when I was at college, when I was doing these evening classes as well as doing the commercial course, I wanted to get involved in politics. No political party fits exactly what we feel and think, because we're individuals and we think, God willing, for ourselves. So I had to choose which was the nearest to what I believed in, and it was the Labour Party. And it was a time of enormous change, as it is now, in the early 60s. And Harold Wilson had just been elected the leader of the Labour Party, who became Prime Minister in '64, and was promising a technological revolution. You hear it again now in terms of what's happening with entirely different new technology across the world and social media. Then it was very much technology in the workplace in terms of transforming old practices and changing the way things were done. And I joined at the age of 16, and I got on the City Council at the age of 22, having taken 6 years to get the qualifications to get into university. I was on the council and at university at the same time, so I was actually learning about politics and political theory, and I was trying to practice it at local level as well. I had a dog then who she was very attuned, I thought, or my tutors thought, to what they were lecturing about, because every time one of them mentioned Karl Marx, the dog yelled, until we found out that the student sat behind me used to stand on her tail every time the remarks came up. So we never took the shine off it because we thought we'd got a dog we could take around the country as a great glad. I then became leader of the council. Interesting time while Thatcher was Prime Minister. The city was under siege because steel and mining were closing around us and engineering. Things were changing, but not necessarily for the better, or rather they were changing too quickly, without adjustment, without planning, preparing people to be able to gain new skills and to be able to adapt. I suppose it's all happened now. Have any of you seen the 490? It's bits of it I found funny. Most of it was actually a tragic portrayal of major social upheaval, where relationships were changing, industry was collapsing, people were trying to adjust but without the backing. One or two funny bits of northern humour in there as well, but that's obviously much better film if you ever play, if you ever get a chance to see them. Same era, but with a different take on it altogether. And then I was fortunate enough to be selected for a seat in the constituency that I represented on the council, in the area that we brought up in before I had to go away to boarding school, and was able to get into Westminster in 1987. And it was a long 10-year haul to get into government in 1997. A lot of interesting things on the way. Dogs played a part. Never forget when Tony Blair went to see Rupert Murdoch at a conference off an island near Australia. It was all part of the new Labour effort to get elected and to smooth those who actually been vehemently against the Labour Party for a decade. It was an effort to try and win them over. Came back overnight. It was Prime Minister's questions. He was leader of the opposition. He stood up at the dispatch box to ask John Major a question, stood on the dog's ear. The dog yowled. He apologised to the dog. The dog yowled again. It's the only living example of a dog being represented in Hansard, the written record of Parliament, that the dog had cried out. And Tony said to me afterwards, look, I've got enough trouble with politics without your dog with what's going on. When we got in 97, I became Education and Employment Secretary. I've been doing it in opposition for 2.5 years, and before that I was Shadow Health Secretary. And just a small interesting point, there were still people then who didn't think that someone who couldn't see could actually work at that level. There were people telling me about people on my own backbenchers who thought that this was going to end in tears. Well, it did, but not quite for that reason. I'll explain in a minute. And we have come a long way. Attitudes have changed towards disability, but there's still a lot of room for improvement, and people making assumptions about other people rather than actually being prepared to listen and learn and change their view according to what people themselves think they can do. I would never have put it to be an airline pilot. You'll be very pleased to. Although actually these days most airline pilots do fly blind, literally, on the instruments. You wouldn't particularly want to commit yourself to it, and I wouldn't want to be in an automatic self-drive car, to be honest, at the moment, although eventually I imagine by the time you reach retirement age, most vehicles will drive themselves, although I expect they'll still have to have some fail-safe device. I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime, not safely anyway. I mean, they do it, and they are. We get experiments and films doing it and all the rest of it, but I wouldn't fancy it. They knew I was going to be Education and Employment Secretary inside the department, so they prepared, and it was really good. We walked in and they were all very welcoming and all the rest of it. New era, new party, all the rest. And they prepared a document for me in Braille using the new software that was linked onto the computer that they bought, and they bought a transcriber, like a Braille printer, to print out the Braille. And I got to Downing Street and I opened it up and I couldn't read a word of the Braille, and it didn't matter because I knew it backwards anyway, and I ad-libbed, and Tony didn't notice I was ad-libbing, so And I went back and I said, we're going to have to check about this because I need statistics, I need agendas sometimes, can't just work on memory. And they shot off and they came back, they said, Secretary of State, we found out what the problem is. We bought the Braille transcriber from Sweden. And they hadn't switched it over. So, I mean, Swedish as a language is challenging enough, but Swedish Braille is absolutely impossible. So it was a new awakening. And we had good times. I mean, it was a time of real energy and drive, and we should have done a lot more than we did in those first few years. I was in Cabinet for 8 years, and I'm very proud of what we did, much prouder than many of my later colleagues who should have been, because if you go into an election like 2010 or 2015 and you're not proud of what your government did when it was in office, how the hell can you expect people to vote for you? And I'm really pleased with what I was able to achieve in those years, but I could have done a lot better. And you just get to know how to do the job in politics. This is not true of the law, but in politics, when nobody wants you to do it anymore. It's one of those just sad truisms you've learned as you've grown, as you've developed and matured in the job, and then you're out, and then you're in danger of lecturing everyone else how best to do it. And times change, I mean, people change. Who could ever have dreamt that we might be facing President Donald Trump, President Vladimir Putin, and Prime Minister Boris Johnson? How does it? I'll just let you roll that over. Politics may be different to mine, but I'm like that when I think about it. And we had good times. Remember opening the first new nursery. People are not aware that there was no nursery programme before '97. In fact, there was still an argument going on that nursery education was quite bad because it took children away from their mothers. And therefore, we ought to be really investing in nursery education at all. And we went down to open this new nursery in the East End of London. And I was with Tony Blair, and I sat on this tiny stool. You know, in nurseries, they have these very tiny chairs. And I was trying to learn to be really relaxed and not a pompous politician. And I put my arm around the little person sat next to me, and I said, "How old are you, my dear?" 23. As a nursery nurse. When I introduced the Sex Offences Act, I might have been caught. I was very fortunate to be Education and Employment Secretary because they were great. Those 4 years were great years. We were investing in the future. Young people were getting jobs. We were introducing quality legislation like the Disability Rights Commission, extending the Disability Discrimination Act. We were doing things like diversity. The government as a whole were introducing, as you know, the Human Rights Act, the Data Protection Act, the Freedom of Information Act, and the devolving powers to Scotland and Wales, somewhat haphazardly, it has to be said, but we were doing it. There were some reforms to the House of Lords, which I'm now in. This present government is the first Conservative government in history that doesn't have a majority, an automatic majority in the House of Lords. Because until 1999, they had most of the hereditary peers, and there were over 400 of them. And when things got difficult, they just clicked and they all came out from their country houses and things and voted. And then from 2010, the coalition meant that they got the Liberal Democrats whipped to vote with them as well. And now they haven't got either of those things. There are still 92 hereditary peers. We should have simply said that when any of those 92 retired or died, because you can now retire from the Lords formally and keep your title but not participate, we should have said that their places wouldn't be filled, but we didn't. So the only elected members of the House of Lords are elected by the existing hereditary peers, who elect a new person from hereditary peers to fill up the 92 places, which is a classic British solution to constitutional change, where the House of Lords itself was likely to be a block on changing the House of Lords. So we've always managed to muddle through. When we tried to do it with the Big Bang solution, like Nick Clegg's bill in 2011, it's almost inevitably bitten the dust because these things are so difficult and contradictory. We were about to elect a Senate with massive power, but with 15 non-renewable terms for the senators, which meant, I'd have stood in Yorkshire as a member of the Senate, but without any recall, any accountability, and with responsibility entirely in our hands, but with the legitimacy of having been elected. We're not legitimate in the sense that we are not able truly to be able to face down and challenge. So Commons, we can amend, we can send things back, and we have been doing. As soon as I got in October, we defeated the government of the tax credit debacle, and we made major changes to the housing planning bill, to the immigration bill, and to the trade union bill, actually with all party support, not just the crossbenchers and the Lib Dems and Labour voting together, but quite often with some of the Conservatives as well. We've actually put things back, but we do know in the end that we're not elected, and that we don't have the right to override a government that has that specifically in their manifesto, whereas a Senate would have had the legitimacy, the consent, to be able to override the Commons, but without any recall, and with people doing exactly what they like. So we thought that was at least I thought it was a pretty important piece of legislation, just to illustrate how difficult it is. And here we are now in 2016 with a referendum created because of divisions within the Conservative Party, with a real danger that Britain might come out of the European Union. If it does, that the Scots will demand another referendum on independence, which they would probably carry, with the United Kingdom collapsing, with the impact of global change, including instability and insecurity because of terrorism, with an ever-increasing dominance of major global companies, whether it's Google and Facebook or Apple, or whether it's large mining or financial institutions, changing the world around us. And at this moment, we're probably least stable than we've ever been in terms of political vision of the future. And I brought us up to date on that because I'm very happy for us to have a discussion about that this afternoon as well. Where are we going? What sort of politics do we need? One of the mistakes the Labour government made from '97 was not to change the way we do politics. I don't just mean devolution to Greater Manchester or Sheffield or elite city regions. I'm in favour of it, although I think it's still muddled in terms of how you develop real accountability locally, what the role of councillors will be with elected mayors, what the engagement with the public will be. I think there's real challenges there. But devolving and decentralising is a good thing. But we need to think through much more how we could empower people where they're at, either at work or in the community, and we didn't, and we still aren't doing that. So that we could say to people, look, politics isn't about us who are elected or nominated politicians. It's about the decisions that are being taken on a daily basis about your lives and how we can engage more with you to make that possible. One good example, 11 years ago, and where people really did have influence, and where I think we should draw down as an example and try and use it in the future, was a major campaign called Make Poverty History. And a lot of young people in particular combined across international boundaries. There were concerts. The concerts weren't the main part of it, but the concerts drew attention to it. There were major international global stars who were prepared to play in Hyde Park or in Paris or in Sydney or New York or whatever, and got attention. But actually what was going on underneath in terms of pressurising elected politicians in each of the major developed countries, the way in which that impacted on presidents and prime ministers, the way that momentum got interest in the media, actually got to a position where at the Gleneagles Summit in July 2005, there was real pressure for change that would provide debt redemption and proper action by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank for sub-Saharan Africa and beyond, and where the beginnings of a proper debate about climate change and the way in which the international community could combine to take action was actually made possible. 1.5 million people walked through Edinburgh on that weekend before the Gleneagles Summit. A lot of this has been forgotten now because two other events took place in the same week. One was a good one, which was London won the 2012 Olympics. The other was the attack on the Underground at Tavistock Square, where 52 people were killed. And all of that happened in the same few days, 3 days. And the Make Poverty History campaign is probably the bit that lost out in terms of people forgetting. I just want to say this about counter-terrorism and civil liberties. I'm not going to be remembered as Home Secretary in the way that Roy Jenkins was remembered as being a, quote, liberal Home Secretary, although Roy benefited from the fact that most of the major changes in social legislation were brought forward as private members' bills by backbenchers, and he as Home Secretary backed them in Cabinet and as part of government, and obviously helped enormously in doing that. But they were private members' bills on homosexuality being legalised, on the death penalty and on abortion. Most of the things that I was involved in sounded really tough, like the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act, like two major immigration bills. And forgotten are things like the Sex Offences Act, which put right 100 years of nonsense, known as the Oscar Wilde clause, in terms of people's personal lives and what they did in private with each other. Or the Domestic Violence and Victims Act, which started a long process of tackling domestic violence and inequality under the law between men and women, or the Proceeds of Crime Act, or the Antisocial Behaviour Act. I mean, those were things that I was equally proud of, alongside the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act. And here's one that you will have come across, the Criminal Justice and Sentencing Act 2003. A lot of things in that I'm very proud of. If I had my time again, I would have changed the indeterminate sentences clauses, because we were requested by the judiciary at the highest level, by the what was then Law Lords, but is now the Supreme Court, to allow judges discretion as to when indeterminate sentences should be applied. And as you probably will have come across on your courses, they were applied quite bizarrely, so that people who would otherwise have been sentenced to 18 months or 2 years ended up with indeterminate sentences. Some of them from 2006, 7, 8 are still in prison now, because the courses and the therapy programs to allow them to demonstrate to the parole board that they were safe to be released weren't available, or weren't available at the time. And there's still a very large number of people on those courses. I illustrate it just to show that sometimes you get things wrong. When you intended that these sentences would apply to people who would otherwise have been sent to prison for a long time, but where you couldn't guarantee they were safe on release at the end of the specified term. And therefore you're learning as you go along. And if we don't learn from history, we're idiots. If we live in history rather than learn from it, we're idiots. And I think that my message really this afternoon is you will be playing an enormous part in the well-being of people's lives individually, of our business and economic competitiveness in terms of commercial law. You'll be doing a fantastic job on ensuring that people have their civil liberties and their rights protected. And you will also be involved in politics with a small p, because the law is about our constitution, our access to our rights. It is about how we shape those, the advice we receive on how we put legislation together and how it's implemented, the interpretation of it, and the way that very often, not just through administrative law and judicial review, but actually also through the way in which case law is developed, we change the world around us. And small p politics is about changing the world for the better. So you might not like to think of yourselves as being politicians, but you are. Ask for whatever you like. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, David. Does anyone here have any questions that they'd like to put? Okay, if I can...
You can just kick off and then people will join in.
I think we've got one question come from the middle here.
You mentioned that you were proud of the majority of your record estates actually. Do you still stand by the anti-terror legislation, and in particular extending detention for that trial?
Yes, I do, because I was dealing with the situation at the time. Part 4 of the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act, which was struck down by the law lords in December 2004, which had passed through both Houses of Parliament and had been amended quite strongly in the House of Lords, tried to balance not taking away the rights of British citizens with the evidence that was being adduced about the risk of attack, and therefore the small number of people who were not UK citizens who posed a threat to our life and liberty. And the context of that was that at the time it was believed, and I think it was probably true at that moment, that most of the immediate threat was from externally organised forces as opposed to homegrown terrorism. And therefore the people that we were intending to certificate in the end 17 actually were people who had infiltrated into the country, who were being manipulated and directed from outside, and who posed a threat in a way that was difficult to deal with in open court. And it was the Lords, it was the law lords, part of the Lords, that actually suggested that we should use that particular part of existing immigration law, which allowed for the equivalent of a High Court process to be adopted, the tribunal, with lawyers representing the individuals concerned, so that they would have representation and that their case would be heard by a High Court judge. But the lawyers taking the case would be on an approved panel, i.e. they themselves would have been security vetted. Now it sounds really clumsy, but at the time the alternative was going to be control orders, which were eventually brought in 2005 by my successor Charles Clarke, which caused the most enormous controversy, then changed to TPIMs by Theresa May, which themselves have then been challenged and which have proved to be fairly ineffective. There's 4 or 5 people on the run at the moment who the police are still trying to pin down. So over these last 14 years, we've tried very hard to try and get this right within the context of overall British law. In the end, I think we've never come to terms with the fact that you sometimes will have to present evidence in closed session, but with all the existing rights that people would expect to have still in place, but not with the case being publicly reported and with the lawyers having been cleared security-wise, because otherwise you always get yourself into a twist that you can't present certain parts of the evidence because it would reveal the work of the intelligence and security agencies, or you don't take the case at all, and I still don't think we've come to terms with that. So a rather convoluted answer, but you are lawyers and you do understand that these are difficult things.
I think that question illustrates a wonderful point between the balance of personal information and liberty and state oversight. And there was a recent situation between Apple and the FBI, which I presume everybody would have seen. The information that's held on devices and all the information that we're putting on social media, do you think that that is a useful tool for agencies to be able to use, or is that a step too far?
No, I think we need very, very rigid rules as to how and when the agencies, whether they're ours or in America, should be allowed through a judicial process to seek access to them. Again, there's a complication here because Apple are totally hypocritical. They've reached a completely different deal with China because they want the 1.2 billion China market. I'm using this as an illustration of a speech on Thursday about why, even though I'm a Eurosceptic, we should remain in Europe, because this is about power. Who exercises power? Apple knew that they weren't going to have access to China unless they agreed to the Chinese government's requirements in terms of access to information and suppression of freedom of communication. And I wish to just be open and honest about it and say, yeah, we are hypocrites. We will read one thing with a totalitarian regime and we're resisting entirely another in a free and democratic country. I think in the end we've got to come off the hook. And I was surprised they hadn't used it in the first place by saying we're prepared to buy in and use expertise in the black the black economy that exists with the dark web, and people who know what they're doing. And it said something about the FBI and the CIA that they don't have that facility immediately on tap. And I went to GCHQ 8 weeks ago because they're trying to persuade those of us who are likely to take part in the debate about the investigatory powers bill that's going through the two houses of Parliament at the moment. They want to smooze us. And I had quite an interesting conversation with them down there about what they thought was necessary. And they are quite open to having rigorous judicial oversight of what they do. And we have to believe it, because otherwise we become so paranoid, we'd allow forces that would pull us down to be able to do things to us that we can never do to them.
Of course. And of course these things, they always inevitably impact what we've come to know as human rights. And this government is set on abolishing the Human Rights Act, and you've already said that you're quite proud of that. Yeah. In terms of a British Bill of Rights and retraction from the ECHR, what would your view on that be?
Well, I think we draw from the ECHR. We've actually sent a signal to Russia and others that we've abandoned all that we actually fought for and developed in the post-war Second World War period. Much of the rights that are built into the convention were developed from this country. Much of the way in which modern European Western democracy developed were a reaction to what people had experienced previously. And it would be a really big mistake. It is unlikely that the government will do that, in which case, why have a Bill of Rights? Why not just update, if you wish to, the Human Rights Act?
Thank you. Are there
Who
any
else? Anything at all?
questions?
Back, forward, front?
Yep, we've got one here on the left.
You mentioned about Scottish independence and the potential for Scottish independence. Connected to that, how do you feel about the concept of English votes for English laws?
I think it's perfectly possible to have part of the parliamentary process which is undertaken by those members of Parliament elected from that part of the UK which will be affected by those laws, but with the final decision being taken by Parliament as a whole. The minute you don't take decisions by Parliament as a whole, you've really undermined the basis on which that Parliament was elected. And the reason I say that is because we elect a government. Of course we elect individual MPs, but they're elected on a platform. It's understood that the government is made up from the House of Commons, from Parliament, not from outside. In the case of the US or France, and to a considerable extent in Germany as well, the executive, the cabinet, is chosen by the President or the Prime Minister, depending on which country, and can be drawn from people outside and not just inside Parliament. Our system is different. Our government is made up of those who are already inside Parliament, and we elect that government to make coherent overall decisions. You could end up, if you had English votes for English laws full stop, i.e. you could just trump them, you could end up with a government that had an overall majority in the United Kingdom but couldn't carry its own legislation on issues such as education and health, which had been devolved to the different parts of the UK, which would be a farcical situation where you had a manifesto commitment but you couldn't carry it through. Now, all of it is messy. The more you devolve, the messier it gets, the more clumsy it gets. But as I was saying earlier, politics, democracy is pretty messy. I mean, you know, it isn't a simple, rational process. And we get it right somehow, even though very often it takes us time to make those changes. And anybody who thinks you can, in the 21st century, write a constitution and it will stand, need to see the convoluted ways in which the United States have changed things from 200 years ago, not just by amendments to the Constitution, but by the use of their Supreme Court, which is used highly politically. In the debate at the moment about who replaces one of those who died on the Supreme Court and who's elected in November as president will have a major say in this, and the way in which they politicised it means that it's actually a very substantial part of the US Constitution. I don't want us to have our Supreme Court having to make rulings of that sort, and I fear that we might move down that road if we don't get this right.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yeah, got one here on the left and we'll come to you.
What's your opinion on the proposed changes to the way solicitors get qualified and trained, referring to the new exam?
Well, we're going to be doing a seminar on this at 4:30, so I'm glad you raised it. The SRAs, which is regulation agency, have come up with training for tomorrow, which intends to change things. I'm very strongly in favour of reform and modernisation. We're going to have new routes, apprenticeships, we're going to have new modules which link more traditional LLB or DGL and LPC with other modular parts of qualifications that will benefit people in terms of their future development in the profession. But I think anything that dilutes the quality and professionalism and standing of the legal profession is not just damaging in terms of your futures, I think it's damaging in terms of the reputation of the profession as a whole. And given the massive employment in the legal profession in this country, around 300,000 people, the contribution to our gross domestic product, which is about 1.5% of GDP, the reputation we have, and the extent of English and New York law in terms of its outreach and its range, I think we'd be making a very big mistake if we change things on a whim. So I think organic change, wanting greater consistency in terms of examinations, they're talking about this SQE, looking at ways in which access can be improved, trying to modify the enormity of the costs of particular parts of qualification. I'm up for looking at those things, but simply throwing the baby out with the bathwater will undermine the whole point of a high reputation, high standing profession, which people actually have to have trust. I mean, people have to believe that when you're providing advice, that you know what you're talking about, that there's sufficient specialism there to have confidence in what you're doing, whether it's in insurance or employment law or whatever. And so I think they need to take very great care in not just doing this because we must change and it's time for a shake-up.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a question?
Just to follow on from something you spoke about earlier, when you were talking about some of your colleagues in the legislature not necessarily thinking you would fit the role you had, what barriers do you think still exist for people who wouldn't necessarily go into politics at the sort of level you operated at, and how do you think they can be overcome?
I think partly the view of politics. I think people are just put off it by the nature of what they see, and that ranges from the absolute theatre of Prime Minister's questions, which I have to say I haven't missed at all. I mean, it became a complete farce, really, a shouting shot. To do Jeremy Corbyn justice, his style has sort of calmed things a bit because he doesn't like doing it and was trying to operate in a different way. But Ed Miliband tried before, it's very hard to change it, and it creates a terribly bad image. Secondly, that in doing our politics differently, we have to be much more open about when we can't change the world with a magic wand, and try and build confidence in that way. People think that if they don't promise the earth, or they don't present themselves as having absolute certainty, that people will mistrust them. I think they mistrust us a lot more when we pretend that we know it all, or that we've got all the solutions. I think it's better to be absolutely open to people. But I think fundamentally, we need to have much better political education, citizenship education in schools and colleges. We need to get across much more clearly the message, as I was trying to say earlier, that politics is about everything we do and not just what politicians do to us and that we should have a say. And I was hoping that the referendum debate would be an opportunity to try and illustrate those issues about where does power lie, how do we counterweight it. When Facebook wanted to use people's private information, the upsurge of feeling by Facebook users pushed them back. That was political. We need to build on those sort of examples of the way in which people can react to what's happening around them in entirely different ways to the past and get a result and then demonstrate that that result can counterweight even the most substantial, powerful forces that exist across the globe, which is why the European Union joining together and counterweighting international finance or taking part in the World Trade Organization negotiations or dealing with Google is much more likely to succeed than Britain on its own. Now, if we could get that message across, I think people would say, yeah, I do want to take an interest, firstly, in politics. Secondly, yeah, not necessarily in Parliament, but at a particular level here, I'd like to get engaged. I'd like to find out how I could make a difference. And politicians welcoming that rather than seeing that as a fear. And in a perverse kind of way, because I'm not a Corbynista, the upsurge of feeling from young people towards Jeremy Corbyn and his campaign and afterwards was quite refreshing. I think it was misleading to believe that sometime there was going to be a revolution where Conservative voters were going to vote for red and tooth and claw socialism, or people who've never voted in their lives are suddenly going to vote. And actually 92 out of the 800 lowest turnout constituencies are already Labour, so it wasn't going to actually change the world in the way that the Communists think. But it is very refreshing to find that someone actually had made a connection by just speaking in a different way. And I think that's welcome, although I can't say the same for Donald Trump in the United States.
Given Jeremy Corbyn's mandate that he won in the election, do you think the way the Parliamentary Labour Party are treating his leadership is fair and consistent with democracy?
I think there are two elements to this. I think treating Jeremy badly is not acceptable. I think that whether people agree with him or not, he is the elected leader, and there is an obligation to show acceptable respect as we would wish for ourselves. I think it's perfectly legitimate to question and continue to question what I would describe as their project, the people around Jeremy and the project being that they can somehow win on a platform that doesn't involve winning over Conservative voters. And I think it's a flawed project rather than a flawed individual. Jeremy's believed in it all his life, so I can't say, would you do a double somersault? Which is why the article I wrote the day after his election for a Sunday newspaper said there's going to be tiers one way. Either Jeremy has to change and the people around him have to change their mind, in which case their supporters will be disillusioned, or we're going to lose the election and the electorate will be disillusioned.
Okay, thank you. Have we got any other questions? Yeah, we've got one here and then we'll come into the middle.
You talk about respect for Jeremy Corbyn. Just similarly, would you say the same about Donald Trump if he were the elected president? And also, what do you think about the no platform movements that are sort of happening against Donald Trump in the UK quite a lot?
I think the Americans have got a very interesting history. Some people have tried to undermine it scurrilously with Barack Obama, but a very interesting history where they've distinguished between respect for the president and the presidency from the individual. I mean, George Bush didn't do too good at holding this, it has to be said. But it is true, and people you meet in America, and particularly Americans abroad, do make that distinction. And I think we would have to make it. We would have to respect the position of the president if he was elected. I don't think that that means that we should not make our position clear domestically. And I think that people saying we don't want to give you a platform is perfectly acceptable. I don't think it would be acceptable for a British government to refuse entry of the President of the United States to the UK. I just don't think that's on. So there's a difference. Universities, major industrial commercial organisations, political parties and Parliament could legitimately say we don't wish to give you a platform, we don't agree with what you're doing or saying. Incidentally, God forbid that he were elected, I think most people, including some people who will vote for him, won't help us. don't believe he will carry through some of the things he's saying, which is terrible, really. I mean, it just means a kind of deep cynicism that we want a change, we're fed up with the status quo. Ironically, and this is always the great twist, isn't it? It's true of a number of people, whether it's Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson or Trump. They say, oh, well, we're on an anti-political kick, or we're against the establishment. And of course, these people are absolutely embedded in the establishment, but they're playing the anti-establishment ticket. And it's really interesting how people fall for that. And then afterwards they'll be disillusioned, but they should be disillusioned now, not after.
Got a question there.
In your capacity as former Education Secretary, do you think that forced academisation of schools in England is good for education? And further to that, has Nicky Morgan damaged her position in the Cabinet by backtracking so quickly?
Well, I think she's done so better by backtracking than trying to carry it through. I'm not a Johnny Come-Lately on this. I wrote an article 8 weeks ago in the Observer saying what I'm about to say now, namely that I think that the original concept of academisation to deal with grossly failing schools that were letting pupils down had a sensible raison d'etre, forcing all schools into one particular type of status and breaking the links with local government out of ideological fervour made no sense at all practically in terms of the number of people who were capable of leading these multi-academy trusts, financially in terms of the cost of doing it, educationally in terms of the disruption that it caused if you don't do it on an organic graduate basis, made it really a silly thing to do. And I chair a multi-academy trust, and voluntarily I don't get paid for it. What I'm trying to do is to put the glue back in so that we now operate on a cluster model. We get schools working with schools. We're developing programs that actually will work with other multi-academy trusts and local authorities in which area we operate, like Hull and Grimsby and Northamptonshire, so that we can actually put that back together again. And that's what we're going to have to do in the future. I think the analogy that we were trying to draw a few weeks ago with health is a good one, where you could have achieved change in a more moderated way, and people would have applauded it, by throwing everything up in the air and trying to pretend you could do it overnight. You actually created havoc. Whether Nicky Morgan will be there in the reshuffle, I'm sure she'll be back in cabinet because she's on the right side of the Euro referendum if it's won. But whether she'll be in the education brief, I doubt it. I think there'll be a very big reshuffle after the 23rd of June. Michael Gove will probably retain his post as Justice Secretary. I think he's probably found within the Conservative ranks the job he likes and is best at. Don't you know, he's quite refreshing compared to Chris Graham anyway. But don't get me onto Chris Graham.
If we could just turn to the referendum on the European Union for a moment. A lot of the campaign so far has been said to the negative. If you could paint a vision post the referendum, what would be the future of the UK?
It would be the UK building alliances, using its influence, working with people of goodwill who are against overbearing bureaucracy, who don't want a top-down commission-run Europe, who understand that combining together is about building strength to protect us, not to undermine our democracy and our well-being, that there are major blocks, financial, industrial and national blocks across the world that we have to deal with in the real world, and that people understand that in the other 27 countries, and by working with them and making the argument and really joining in, participating vigorously, we can't only get something out of it, but we can put a lot into it. That if we're out of the European Union, it doesn't mean everybody else doesn't carry on. It doesn't mean that what they decide, their influence doesn't affect us, because it would in every sphere, internationally as well as directly on our country and what we have to do. I heard the most ridiculous interview on the Today programme about 10 days ago about whether we should be allowed to have our own packaging on goods and services, and how we could escape the top-down imposition of requirements on packaging in goods and what have you. Well, actually, if we wanted to sell our goods into Europe, we still have to adhere to their packaging. But we would have had no influence on arguing against overbearing regulation on packaging and things that weren't necessary. So there's a kind of self-delude here that if you cut the umbilical cord and you go back to some halcyon era, we'd be okay. We could all just ignore the rest of the world, cut ourselves off and carry on as though nothing was happening outside our boundaries. Well, you know, the world doesn't work like that.
If we accept that we would still have to continue with the relationship with continental Europe if we were to leave the European Union. Is the fundamental point not that we would have the choice as to what law we implemented as opposed to being led by the Commission?
Well, we have a choice now because we're very successful over the years from Thatcher onwards in building in opt-outs. We're not part of the Eurozone. We wanted to be part of, and the ad campaign got themselves in the middle of this. We're part of the single market. We could negotiate, as Norway do, to actually go back into, and Switzerland have separate negotiated rights as well, to go back into parts of the European Union framework, but we wouldn't have a say in their alteration. We would just have to negotiate going back in on the terms laid down by those who were putting it together in the Council of Europe. So it seems to me a very odd situation to want to be in most of it, and yet not to have a say over the design of it, because you get the worst of both worlds. And incidentally, you have to cough up. You're not free of having to pay in for those aspects of the European regulations, the European activity that you join in with. So I'm just hoping that in the next 4 weeks we will have a slightly better debate than we've had so far. I do think that the Yard Booth stuff and over-exaggeration on both sides doesn't help. I think it puts people off. And the result will probably be affected most by the generation represented in this room, because at the moment, less than 40% of the over 30s say they'll vote, whereas over 70% of the over 65 say they'll vote. And that could well skew the result quite strongly, and it's a result about the future, not the past. So it's really, I find that quite lovely. Sure. Thank you.
Do we have any final questions? Yes.
Perhaps one of the most poignant questions. We're facing nowadays, Britain faces nowadays, one of the biggest flows, migrant crisis from the World War II, and certainly does play hand to Eurosceptics who say that is not acceptable for Britain. Do you think that the European Union can help stop the growth of the flow of migrants into the country? Should we do that?
I shall argue this very strongly on Thursday. I hope I manage to get the message across. I believe that it's only by being inside the European Union and contributing that we can manage what is the most enormous mass migration people movements that we've ever had in history. If you discount the millions who are displaced inside countries, about 19 million people are displaced and on the move outside their country of origin. And we've seen that in terms of the flow into Europe particularly from Turkey, but also from North Africa. And there's no way in which Greece or Italy or Spain can deal with that on their own, or should be abandoned to do that. And only by recognising that what happens on the outer border of the European Union and contributing towards those solutions can we have a lasting programme. Secondly, we all ought to be joining together anyway, not just the European Union, but globally, on dealing with the causes and the displacement factors and working on that. There's an acceptance intellectually that that's right, but getting people to actually do it is another matter. And although people are using Turkey as a battering ram and saying, oh God, if Turkey come in, 5 million people will arrive from Turkey tomorrow, it's all rubbish. Actually, the deal that was done, not by us because we were part of it, but the deal that was done by substantial number of the European Union members with Turkey to stem the flow of those coming through Greece and Macedonia and elsewhere into Germany has worked. I mean, it has actually stemmed the flow. And that was by agreement, by countries joining together to agree. Now we need to follow that up by resettlement measures within the European Union. Just to give you a very quick example, then we'll finish. In 2002, I reached agreement with Nicolas Sarkozy, who was then the Interior Minister, later President of France, not just to close the camp that existed in Calais at the time, but also to put a new zone on French soil to move our border from England to France. And we still have, immigration, security and customs staff in that zone. They double check those coming through. It's a new border control. Were we not part of the European Union, why should France allow us to have our border on their soil? They did it by agreement with us 14 years ago because we were part of the same union. Our border, our outer border, was the outer border and the west of the European Union. But it wouldn't be anymore. The French border would be. I can't see an argument why France would put up with that any longer. And therefore, why would they stem the flow of people coming across into the United Kingdom? Not just formally with documentation, forged or otherwise, but illegally as well. When we took the decision in 2004 to allow the E8 countries, the new, leaving out Cyprus and Malta, who already have these rights, but the E8 countries, the citizens who are going to be allowed to move freely, when we said they could work legally and therefore pay tax and national insurance and register to work, 40% of those who registered were already in the country. In other words, they were working here illegally already. And that's what would happen in the future. So I think it's really the exact opposite argument to the one that the Brexit people are putting in terms of immigration. And it's damned hard to argue that in a community like the one I used to represent, where UKIP came second in the by-election that took place in my own constituency on the 5th of May because of my successor, Guy, sadly, and won seats in the city council elections. And it's hard to argue it because people's minds have been made up, haven't they? It's an emotional spasm thing rather than a rational argument.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.